A single father, 7 years of invisible genius, one corrupt executive who stole it all. And the moment they threw Ethan Mercer out the door, a multi-million-dollar aerospace assembly started dying in Bay 7, exactly like he warned. Now the CEO, who never knew his name, needs him more than anyone in that building ever admitted. This is the story of what happens when the wrong man gets pushed too far and the truth refuses to stay buried. If this story grabs you, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Follow along and don't leave before the ending. You won't want to miss what happens. The morning Ethan Mercer got fired, he'd already been awake for 4 hours. Not because of Lily. She'd slept fine, curled up under her purple dinosaur blanket with one arm hanging off the edge of the mattress like she always did. He'd checked on her at 5:15, the way he did every morning, standing in her doorway long enough to make sure her breathing was steady and even. It was. It always was. She was the one thing in his life that ran exactly the way it was supposed to. He was awake because of Bay 7. Ethan had been running the numbers in his head since 2 in the morning, lying flat on his back staring at the water stain on his bedroom ceiling, the one shaped vaguely like the state of Texas, doing calculations he'd already done a dozen times before. The thrust reverser housing bracket they'd installed 3 weeks ago was wrong. Not obviously wrong. Not wrong in a way that screamed at you from across the floor. Wrong in a quiet, patient way. The kind of wrong that waited until the worst possible moment to announce itself. He'd flagged it twice. Once in writing, once in person to his shift supervisor, Dale Hutchins, who'd nodded and said he'd pass it up the chain. Ethan knew what that meant. It meant nothing. By 6:30, he was in the kitchen making Lily's lunch, peanut butter on wheat, the crust cut off and apples sliced into eighths because she said eighths were the right size, and he'd long since stopped questioning her reasoning on things like that. He packed it into her Pikachu lunchbox, zipped it shut, and stood at the kitchen counter for a moment with his coffee, watching the light change outside the window. Their apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building in East Dayton that had seen better decades. The neighborhood wasn't dangerous so much as it was tired. Tired houses, tired cars parked along tired curbs, a bodega on the corner that had the same hand-lettered sale signs in the window for as long as Ethan could remember. He didn't mind it. He'd grown up not far from here. The apartment was clean, it was theirs, and the school 3 blocks away was solid enough that Lily had a teacher who actually seemed to care. That was what mattered. He drove Lily to school at 7:40, which was later than her class started but earlier than the bell, because she liked to talk to her friend Maya on the playground before the day officially began. He watched her run across the blacktop toward a girl with 2 high pigtails, backpack bouncing, not looking back. She never looked back. He didn't know whether that was a good thing or something he should quietly worry about. He decided it was good. He got to the plant at 8:15. Meridian Aerospace Solutions occupied a sprawling industrial campus on the western edge of the city. Massive corrugated buildings, a half-mile of chain-link fence, a parking lot big enough to feel lonely in. Ethan had worked here for 11 years. He knew every building, every system, every idiosyncrasy, and every piece of equipment on 3 separate production floors. He knew which compressor in Building C ran 4 degrees hot and why. He knew that the hydraulic line feeding the test rig in Bay 4 had a slow leak that maintenance had been patching for 2 years instead of replacing the line. He knew that the load-bearing rail system in Bay 7 made a specific sound, a low metallic groan, almost too low to hear, when the tension calibration was off. He changed into his work clothes in the locker room, clocked in at the terminal, and was heading toward his station when Dale Hutchins intercepted him in the corridor between Building B and Building C. Dale was a heavy-set man in his late 50s with a face that had spent too many years making expressions it didn't mean. He was wearing the look now, the apologetic one, the one that meant he was about to say something he'd been told to say and was hoping Ethan wouldn't make it difficult. "Ethan." He gestured toward the small conference room off the main corridor. "Got a minute?" Ethan looked at him. "I'm scheduled on the Bay 7 line at 8:30. I know, this won't take long." It took 45 minutes. There were 3 people in the conference room. Dale, who stood near the door and didn't say much. A woman from Human Resources named Tamara Wills, who Ethan knew only slightly, She'd processed his benefits paperwork years ago and had a habit of speaking in a tone that was relentlessly gentle regardless of what she was actually saying. And Marcus Holt. Marcus Holt was 49 years old, vice president of production engineering, and had been at Meridian for 14 years. He was expensively dressed for someone who worked in a manufacturing plant, always had been, and he carried himself with the particular ease of a man who was accustomed to having people agree with him before he'd finished a sentence. He was also, as far as Ethan had been able to determine over 11 years, one of the most effectively dishonest people he had ever encountered. Holt sat at the head of the table with a manila folder in front of him. He didn't open it. "Ethan," he said, "we appreciate the years you've put in here. That's not nothing, but we've been doing an assessment of our technical staffing structure, and some difficult decisions have to be made." Ethan sat down across from him. He didn't say anything. Holt continued. "Performance metrics, redundancies, realignment of technical roles." The words came out smooth and rehearsed, each one landing in a neat row like they'd been arranged beforehand. Ethan listened. He had the strange, detached experience of understanding that something significant was happening while simultaneously finding it slightly unreal. He'd given this company 11 years. He'd solved problems they didn't know they had. He'd worked overtime without asking for overtime because he wanted things done right. He'd come in on a Saturday morning 2 Christmases ago. Lily was at her grandmother's, to fix a calibration failure in the coding system that would have cost the company a $250,000 contract. No one had ever formally acknowledged that. The repair had been noted in the maintenance log, attributed vaguely to floor-level adjustments, and never mentioned again. He knew, sitting across from Marcus Holt, exactly what this was about. It was about the CAR-7 technical brief. It was about the documentation he'd submitted 18 months ago outlining a modified assembly tolerance protocol that had since been implemented across the entire production line, shaving an average of 11% off their defect rate. He'd written it himself over the course of 6 weeks, working from his apartment after Lily was in bed. He'd submitted it through official channels with his name on every page. 3 months later, Meridian had quietly filed a process improvement patent. Marcus Holt's name was listed as the lead inventor. Ethan had found out about it 4 months after that. He hadn't made a formal complaint. He'd wanted to. He'd gotten as far as opening his email client, drafting a message to HR, and sitting there staring at it for 20 minutes before Lily had come in asking for help with a jigsaw puzzle. He'd closed the laptop. He'd helped her with the puzzle. And then he'd spent weeks thinking through what would actually happen if he sent that email. The response, the dismissal, the sideways looks, the way these things always seem to go for the person without the VP title, and had eventually arrived at a place of controlled, careful silence, which had apparently not been enough. "Effective today," Tamara Wills was saying gently, "your access badge will be deactivated and will—" "Bay 7, Ethan said. Both of them stopped. "There's a housing bracket on the forward thrust reverser assembly on the 900 series unit. The installation from 3 weeks ago is wrong. The torque specification was misapplied at the shoulder junction. Whoever read the updated spec sheet was working from the previous revision, and they're not the same. The bracket is carrying about 60% more lateral stress than it's rated for." He paused. "At full operational load, it'll fail. When it does, it won't be quiet." Holt stared at him with an expression Ethan couldn't entirely read, somewhere between contempt and something more calculating. "That assembly has been inspected and cleared," Holt said. "By who?" "By our inspection team." "I know who cleared it. I'm telling you the clearance was wrong." "Ethan." Holt leaned forward slightly. "I think you're understandably upset. This is a hard morning, but I need this in writing." Ethan looked at Tamara Wills. "I need it documented that I raised this concern in this meeting before I left the building." There was a pause. "That's not standard protocol for an exit. I'm aware. I'm asking anyway." Another pause. Tamara looked at Holt. Holt gave a very slight shake of his head. "We'll note your concerns," Tamara said carefully. Ethan looked at her for a moment. He understood. He understood exactly how much that meant, which was very close to nothing. "Matandi?" He pushed his chair back, stood up, and picked up the single personal item he'd brought into the conference room with him, a small, scratched-up mechanical pencil he'd carried in his chest pocket every day for 6 years. "All right," he said. He walked out of Building B with his badge still clipped to his shirt. A security guard near the front entrance asked him to hand it over, which he did without argument. He walked across the parking lot to his truck, a 10-year-old F-150 with a cracked dashboard and a tailgate that stuck unless you hit it exactly right, got in and sat there for a minute. He wasn't going to cry. He didn't really feel like crying. He felt something more like a cold, quiet anger that was so deep down it barely registered on the surface, and underneath that, something that might have been relief. He started the truck and drove home. Lily was at school. The apartment was quiet. Ethan sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and his laptop and spent an hour going through his personal files, documents he'd kept copies of, photographs of original handwritten notes, email threads. He wasn't entirely sure why he was doing it or what he planned to do with any of it. Maybe nothing. Maybe it was just that he needed something to do with his hands. He had a folder on his external drive labeled Project Notes, Personal Backup, that contained several years' worth of documentation, engineering sketches, process analyses, calibration protocols he'd developed from scratch, the original draft of the CAR-7 technical brief, time-stamped and intact, dating back 18 months before the patent filing. He sat looking at the folder for a while. Then he closed the laptop and washed his coffee mug and went to the bedroom to change out of his work clothes. The call he'd been waiting for, though he hadn't consciously known he'd been waiting for it, came 11 days later. In the intervening time, he had filed for unemployment, which was easier than he'd expected, called his sister in Columbus, which was harder, taken Lily to the park twice, once to the Science Museum and once to the pizza place she'd been asking about for 3 weeks. He'd updated his resume, which felt strange in the way that resumes always felt strange, reducing 11 years of actual knowledge to bullet points that could fit on 2 pages. He'd had 2 phone screens with companies that were clearly not going to move forward. He'd also, in a quiet corner of his mind, been monitoring the situation at Meridian from the outside. He had contacts there, guys he'd worked alongside for years, people who texted him now and then. One of them, a man named Ray Cortez, who ran the floor crew in Building C, sent him a message on day 8. "You hear anything about Bay 7? Ethan read the message. His stomach dropped. "What happened?" The reply came 6 minutes later. "Don't know the full story yet, but something went wrong in there yesterday. Management's got the doors closed." Ethan set his phone down on the kitchen counter. He looked at the wall. He'd known. He'd said it out loud in that conference room, with 2 witnesses present. He'd told them exactly what was wrong, exactly where, and exactly what the failure mode would be. He picked the phone back up. How bad? Bad enough that they've got outside consultants in there this morning, and something about the 900 series contract being in jeopardy. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. The thing about being right when everyone dismissed you was that it didn't feel like vindication. Not in the moment. In the moment, it felt like standing in a room where the ceiling was coming down and thinking, "Yeah, I told you it would do that." He sent Ray a reply that said nothing more than, "Let me know if you hear more," and put the phone in his pocket, and went to watch Lily's soccer practice, because it was a Tuesday, and that's what Tuesdays meant now. Oh. He was making Lily's breakfast the next morning. Scrambled eggs, which she liked soft, a piece of toast cut diagonally, because that was also somehow important, when his phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer it. He wasn't in the habit of answering unknown numbers. The last 2 times he had, it had been extended auto-warranty calls, which had contributed meaningfully to his current policy of letting unfamiliar numbers go to voicemail. But something made him pick up. Maybe it was just that he had nothing else pressing at that moment. The eggs were done. He slid them onto the plate. "Ethan Mercer?" The voice was a woman's. Controlled, professional, but with something underneath it. A tightness, like a person who is keeping their composure on principle, rather than because it came naturally at the moment. "That's me. This is Sophia Bennett. I'm the CEO of Meridian Aerospace Solutions." He set the pan down on the burner. He knew who Sophia Bennett was. He'd never spoken to her directly. She'd been installed as CEO about 16 months ago when the previous CEO, a man named Gerald Hayward, who'd been at the company for 25 years, had retired. There had been some internal grumbling about an outsider, about her age, she was 32, about whether someone without a manufacturing background could really understand the operational realities of a facility like Meridian. Ethan hadn't participated in those conversations. He didn't have a strong opinion about her one way or another, which was to say he'd been too focused on his own work to form one. "Ms. Bennett," he said. There was a brief pause. He had the impression she was deciding something. "I assume you've heard about what happened in Bay 7. Some of it, not everything. The thrust reverser housing bracket failed under operational load testing. The assembly was significantly damaged. We're currently looking at a minimum of 2 weeks before we can even accurately assess the full extent of the damage, which puts us in direct conflict with our contractual delivery timeline on the 900 series." Another pause. "I also received a summary of your exit meeting last week. You warned them." He didn't respond to that. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I'd like to meet with you, in person." Why? The question seemed to catch her slightly off guard. Not offense, more like she'd expected a yes or a no, not a why. "Because I have a production floor with a major component failure, a contract that's potentially at risk, and a growing number of indications that the technical knowledge required to understand what went wrong and how to fix it may not currently exist inside my building." A beat. "And because you apparently tried to prevent this before you left, which means you understood the system well enough to know what was going to happen. That tells me something." Lily padded into the kitchen in her pajamas, hair disheveled, dragging her stuffed rabbit, a battered, much-loved gray bunny named Mr. Pudding, by one ear. She looked at the scrambled eggs on the counter, then at her father on the phone, and silently hoisted herself onto her chair and picked up her fork. Ethan watched her for a second. "When did you want to meet?" he said. "My mom." He left Lily with Mrs. Abramowitz next door, who was 73 and had been letting him use her as a backup plan since Lily was 4. Mrs. Abramowitz gave Lily approximately 40% too many cookies and let her watch game shows at a volume the neighbors could probably hear, and Lily adored her without reservation. The meeting was at a coffee place Sophia Bennett had suggested, neutral ground, which he'd appreciated, not the Meridian campus. Somewhere quiet, off the main commercial strip, with real coffee and no overhead speakers playing music. She was already there when he arrived. He'd seen photographs. The company website had a headshot, but photographs were notoriously poor at conveying what a person was actually like. Sophia Bennett was medium height, with dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested efficiency rather than style, and she was wearing clothes that were professional but not showy. She was drinking black coffee, and there was a laptop open on the table in front of her and a legal pad with handwritten notes beside it. She looked up when he came in, and what he noticed was that she looked tired. Not exhausted, not collapsing, but the specific tiredness of someone who had been dealing with a genuine crisis for several days and was still holding it together through will alone. She stood and extended her hand. "Mr. Mercer, thank you for coming. Ethan is fine. Sophia." She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit down, please." He ordered coffee. They sat across from each other. She looked at him for a moment. "I want to be direct with you," she said. "That'd be good. We are in a serious position. The 900 series assembly failure has compromised our timeline on a contract worth roughly $18 million. We have until the end of the month before the client has contractual grounds to terminate. That's 22 days. She turned the legal pad toward him briefly. It was covered in notes, timelines, what looked like rough calculations. "I have engineers, I have a production team. What I don't have is someone who actually understands the internal logic of that system well enough to lead a real recovery effort." "You have the design documentation," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Do we?" He held her gaze. "What do you mean?" "In the last 4 days, I've had my technical team trying to locate the original design files, the calibration protocols, the assembly specifications for the 900 series Bay components. What they're finding is incomplete. Files that should exist don't. Archives with gaps, documents that reference technical procedures that appear nowhere in the system." She paused. "I'm starting to think there are things about the technical history of this facility that I was not given an accurate picture of when I took over." Ethan sat back in his chair. He thought about the CAR-7 brief. He thought about the patent. He thought about 11 years of floor-level problem-solving that had been absorbed into the general institutional record without his name attached to any of it. "How much do you actually know?" she asked. Not aggressively, genuinely. He was quiet for a moment. "More than what's in your archives," he said. She waited. The 900 series housing bracket problem isn't isolated. The installation team was working from an outdated spec revision. I don't know if that was negligence or something else, but the result is that they applied a torque value that was superseded in the updated specification. The updated spec was something I developed. He watched her. She was listening without interrupting, which he noted. The original failed because it was carrying lateral load stress it wasn't designed for. The question now isn't just how to repair the assembly. It's how to repair it correctly, which means you need the actual engineering logic behind the design, not just the surface documentation. Which you have. I have my own notes, personal copies of work I did, which is separate from whatever is or isn't in your archives. He paused. Sophia, before we go further, what happened to Marcus Holt? A slight change in her expression, something careful. He's on administrative leave pending an internal review. What kind of review? An audit of procurement and intellectual property documentation going back approximately 7 years. She met his eyes. I'm not going to pretend I have the full picture yet. I don't. But I have enough to know that the picture I was given when I started was significantly incomplete. He nodded slowly. All right, he said. If I come back and help with the recovery, and I'm not saying yes yet, I have conditions. Tell me. An independent investigation, not internal. Outside auditors with no existing relationship to Meridian or Holt, with full access to documentation, archive records, patent filings, and personnel records. He paused. Frontline technicians get authority in the recovery process, not just advisory input, actual decision-making authority on technical matters in their areas. I'm not going to come back and have my work overridden by someone with a title, but not the knowledge. She was listening carefully, writing on the pad. And the audit results get shared with employees, not a sanitized summary, the actual findings. People on that floor have been working in an environment where something was seriously wrong for a long time. They deserve to know what it was. Sophia looked at her notes. She looked at him. Those are serious asks. I know. The independent audit alone will create significant exposure for the company. I know that too. She was quiet for a moment. He watched her. She wasn't panicking, which he respected. She was thinking. If the alternative is losing an $18 million contract and continuing to operate a facility with compromised technical integrity, she said, then those are terms I can accept. He looked at her. She seemed like she meant it. I need it in writing before I come back. You'll have it by end of day. They looked at each other across the table. One more thing, he said. What? I have a daughter. She's 7. Her schedule doesn't move. School drop-off, pickup, Tuesday soccer practice, Thursday reading group. None of that changes. Sophia Bennett blinked. It was the first moment he'd seen genuine surprise on her face. Of course, she said, and something in her voice shifted very slightly, less the CEO managing a crisis, and briefly more like a person encountering an unexpected piece of another person's life. We'll work around it. He gave a single nod. He picked up his coffee and drank it. He told Lily that evening at dinner, grilled cheese and tomato soup, her request, which was what she always wanted when she knew something important was being discussed. He didn't know how she knew. She just did. I'm going back to work, he said. She dragged her grilled cheese through the soup. At the airplane place? Yeah. She thought about this. Did they say sorry? He looked at her. Not exactly. Not yet. She considered that with the patience of a 7-year-old who had seen her father navigate more complexity than most kids understood. But you're going anyway? Yeah? She took a bite. Thought some more. Because of the thing you were worried about? He didn't answer right away. Something broke, he said, and I know how to fix it. Lily looked at him across the table. She had her mother's eyes, this specific shade of brown that picked up gold in certain light. And sometimes she had her mother's habit of looking at him like she was waiting for the part where he told the truth instead of the manageable version. "Okay," she said finally. "But you're still coming to soccer?" "Every Tuesday." She seemed satisfied. She went back to her soup. He watched her for a moment, this small, specific person who organized his entire life around herself without meaning to, without knowing it, the way gravity works. "Mr. Pudding thinks you should go," she said without looking up. "Yeah." "He said the broken airplane thing sounds important." "Tell him I said thanks." She smiled at her bowl. He looked away before she saw him doing the thing where his face got complicated. The written agreement from Sophia arrived at 9:47 that evening. It was 2 pages dense and covered each condition he'd named in language that was specific enough to be real. He read it twice. He sent it to his sister, who had done 2 years of paralegal work before switching careers, with a message that said, "Tell me if this is actually binding or if I'm being played." She replied 40 minutes later. "It's solid. Whoever drafted this wasn't trying to bury the conditions. Go fix your airplane." He put the phone down and stared at the ceiling. The water stain was still there, still shaped like Texas. He thought about the bracket in Bay 7. He could see it perfectly. The specific configuration, the shoulder junction, the stress distribution under lateral load. He'd thought about it so many times over the past weeks that the image was almost tactile, like something he could reach into and touch. He knew how to fix it. He'd always known how to fix it. He thought about 11 years of work that had lived in unsigned documentation and informal contributions and conversations where he'd explained the solution and never been asked for his name. He thought about Lily, asleep down the hall with her arm hanging off the mattress. He set his alarm for 5:15. When he walked back through those gates, he wasn't going to be the man who'd been quietly dismissed and had quietly walked away. That version of the morning was over. He closed his eyes. He thought about the bracket. He went to sleep. He showed up at 7:15. Not because anyone had told him to be there at 7:15. The agreement hadn't specified a start time, and Sophia's assistant had sent a follow-up email the previous afternoon with language like flexible scheduling and at your convenience. He showed up at 7:15 because that was when the floor crew came in, and if he was going to understand the actual state of Bay 7, he needed to see it the way the people who worked it every day saw it, not after management had a chance to tidy the narrative. The security desk was expecting him. A new badge had been prepared. Temporary, orange-bordered, with consultant printed in block letters under his name. The guard who handed it to him was a young guy Ethan didn't recognize, which meant he'd been hired in the last year. The guard looked at the name on the badge, then at Ethan's face, then back at the badge with the careful neutrality of someone who'd been told this was a sensitive situation without being told why. Ethan clipped the badge to his jacket and walked through. The floor smelled the same. That was the first thing. The specific combination of machine oil, metal dust, and recycled air that he'd breathed in every working day for 11 years. It hit him somewhere below thought, the way smells do, and for a half second he felt the disorientation of being returned to a context his body remembered better than his mind had been willing to. Then he heard it. Bay 7's main doors were closed, which was unusual for this time of morning. A cluster of people stood near the entrance. 4 technicians and a floor supervisor named Greg Adler, who Ethan had worked alongside for 8 years. Adler was 51, compact and deliberate in his movements, and had spent his career developing the specific kind of competence that never got noticed until it wasn't there. He saw Ethan coming from 40 feet away. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "You heard," Adler said finally. "Ray told me some of it. How bad is it in there?" Adler looked at the closed doors. His jaw worked slightly. Bad enough that they brought in an outside engineering firm to assess the damage. Beckett Nolan Group, out of Cincinnati. They were in there for 6 hours yesterday. He paused. They left without putting anything in writing. Ethan understood what that meant. When outside assessors declined to put their preliminary findings in writing, it generally meant the preliminary findings were either significantly worse than expected or significantly more complicated to attribute. Who's running the recovery effort? Right now? Adler let out a short breath that wasn't quite a laugh. Nobody, really. Holt's on leave. His deputy, Sandra Kern, has been holding twice-daily status meetings that consist mostly of people telling each other what they don't know yet. He looked at Ethan. And now you're here with a consultant badge. Yeah. What does that mean exactly? It means I'm going to look at what happened and try to fix it. Adler studied him. 8 years of working alongside someone built a particular kind of understanding. Not friendship exactly, but something specific and functional, a mutual calibration. Adler knew how Ethan worked. He knew the difference between Ethan saying something confidently and Ethan knowing something. I need to see inside, Ethan said. Adler pulled out his key card. Set. The 900 series assembly occupied the eastern third of Bay 7, and the damage was worse than Ethan had pictured from Ray's text messages, which was saying something because he'd pictured it fairly clearly. The housing bracket had failed at the shoulder junction exactly as he'd predicted. The lateral stress fracture ran clean through the mounting flange, and when it had gone, it had pulled the adjacent coupling assembly with it. That secondary failure was the one that had really done the damage. The coupling assembly connected to the forward integration harness, and when that had shifted under the sudden load redistribution, it had caused a cascading misalignment across 3 separate subcomponents. The whole forward section looked like something had grabbed it and twisted. Ethan stood in front of it for a long time without speaking. One of the younger technicians, early 20s, Ethan didn't know him, was watching from a few feet back. After about 2 minutes of silence, he said, "You're Mercer, right? The guy they—" He stopped. "Yeah," Ethan said, not turning around. Another silence. "Can it be fixed?" the young tech asked. Ethan looked at the coupling assembly. He looked at the integration harness. He did the geometry in his head, not just of what was damaged, but of the sequence in which it would need to be addressed, and what each step would require, and how long each step would realistically take with the personnel and equipment currently available. "Yeah," he said, "it can be fixed." He heard the young tech exhale. He turned around. "What's your name?" "Danny. Danny Okafor." "How long have you been on this floor, Danny?" 14 months. Ethan nodded. "You know where the specification archive terminal is in Building B? The old one? By the east stairwell? That's the one. I need you to pull every document tagged to the 900 series assembly that was logged before 18 months ago. Anything older than that, print it if you can. If you can't print it, document the file timestamps." He paused. "And if anything asks you for an elevated access code, come find me." Danny looked at him. "Why would it ask for an elevated access code?" "It probably won't," Ethan said, "but if it does." Sophia arrived at 9. She came onto the floor without announcement, which Ethan noted and which was different from the way Holt had operated. Holt's appearances on the production floor had always been preceded by a kind of ambient tension that traveled ahead of him, people straightening up, supervisors appearing from side offices. Sophia just walked in, wearing flat shoes and carrying a tablet, and if she was performing authority, she was doing it in a register he hadn't expected. She found him crouched near the base of the damaged assembly with a flashlight and a measuring instrument, Adler standing beside him. "Tell me what you're seeing," she said. He looked up. "The primary failure is exactly what I described. The secondary and tertiary failures are what's going to drive the timeline." He stood. The coupling assembly shift wasn't just mechanical. It stressed the forward integration harness enough that I need to do a full continuity check before I know whether we're looking at a repair or a partial replacement. "What's the difference in timeline?" "Repair, if everything checks out and the harness is intact, 10 days, maybe 12, working straight through." He paused. "Partial replacement. I'd rather not say until I know." She looked at the assembly. He watched her looking at it. She was absorbing the physical reality of it, which he respected. Some executives in this situation would already be thinking about the liability report, the client call, the press framing. She was looking at the actual thing. "The Beckett-Nolan team from yesterday," she said. "They told me verbally that the damage was, quote, non-standard in its configuration. They said it in a way that suggested they weren't sure how it had gotten this way." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "It means the failure pattern doesn't match a straightforward installation error. The torque misapplication is one piece, but the way the secondary failure propagated, the geometry of it, that follows a stress distribution that only makes sense if you understand the internal load model for this specific assembly. He paused. Which is something I developed, and which, as far as I can tell, was never formally documented in the accessible archive. Sophia looked at him steadily. Because it was never officially attributed to you. He didn't answer that directly. The Beckett-Nolan team couldn't find the load model because it doesn't exist in your system under any name. It exists in my personal notes. She was quiet. How much else is like that? She asked. I don't know the full extent yet, but enough that your inspectors were working blind. She wrote something on the tablet. He couldn't see what. The independent audit team arrives Thursday, she said. Crawford and Associates, out of Columbus. They've been briefed on the scope. Full access, as agreed. Good. Ethan. She hesitated in a way he hadn't seen from her before, the first moment she'd shown something that wasn't the controlled professional surface. I need you to understand that I didn't know. What I'm beginning to understand about the documentation situation, about the patents, I inherited this company 16 months ago. I'm not offering that as an excuse. I'm telling you because I think you need to know where I stand. He looked at her. He believed her. He also knew that what you didn't know could still do damage, and that not knowing wasn't the same as not being responsible for the conditions that let it happen. Both things were true at the same time. Thursday's good, he said. Tell them to start with the CAR7 patent filing. Something crossed her face. You think that's where it begins? I think that's where I can prove it begins. The specification archive terminal in Building B turned up exactly what Ethan had expected, and also something he hadn't. Danny Okafor appeared at the entrance to Bay 7 2 hours after Ethan had sent him, holding a folder of printouts and looking like someone who had encountered something unpleasant and wasn't sure what to do with it. Some of it printed fine, Danny said, but there were about a dozen documents from before the CAR7 period that were listed in the index, but the files themselves were corrupted. Like the file names are there, but the contents are gone. Just those 12? Just those 12. Everything around them is fine. Ethan took the folder. He paged through it slowly. He'd expected gaps, had been prepared for the possibility that some of the documentation he'd submitted over the years had been altered or removed. He hadn't fully worked out the timeline of when it had been done or how systematically. The 12 missing files were in a cluster that corresponded to a roughly 8-month period approximately 4 years ago. That was the period when he'd made his most significant contributions to the production line. The load model, the modified tolerance protocol, 2 separate calibration systems he'd developed for the coding and assembly processes. All of it had fed into the company's efficiency improvements. All of it had eventually found its way into Holt's performance reviews and presentations to the board. He sat down on a tool crate in the corner of Bay 7 and looked at the list of corrupted file names. Ray Cortez, who had come by twice during the morning to check in without making it obvious that he was checking in, drifted over and looked at the folder over Ethan's shoulder. Those the missing ones? Yeah. Ray was quiet for a moment. I always thought there was something wrong with the archive situation. We'd reference old procedures, go to look them up, they'd be gone, or the version number wouldn't match what we remembered. He picked at the edge of his sleeve. People figured it was just system maintenance, database stuff. It wasn't system maintenance. No. Ray paused. You think Holt did it himself or had someone do it? Ethan looked at the list. Probably had someone do it. He wasn't technical enough to do it himself, but he was smart enough to know which files mattered. Ray was quiet for another moment. That's a kind of smart I really don't respect. No, Ethan agreed. Me either. The part that Ethan hadn't anticipated was Sandra Kern. Holt's deputy had been running the holding pattern at Meridian since his administrative leave began, and he'd formed the impression from brief secondhand accounts that she was primarily a process manager, someone who kept meetings organized and timelines documented, and who deferred on technical questions. What he found, when he actually met her on Wednesday afternoon in the main conference room, was something more complicated. Sandra Kern was 44, careful, and had an expression that was permanently calibrated to reveal nothing. She was professionally cordial to him in the way that people were professionally cordial when they were deciding how much of a threat you represented. She'd been at Meridian for 9 years. They were in the conference room to go over the recovery timeline. Sophia, Ethan, Adler, Sandra, and 2 other senior staff. Ethan had spent the morning sketching out a preliminary repair sequence, and he walked through it in about 15 minutes using a whiteboard and no slides, because he didn't need slides for something he'd been carrying in his head for 2 weeks. When he finished, Sandra said, "The continuity check you're proposing for the forward integration harness, that protocol isn't in our standard procedures documentation." "No," he said, "it's not. So it's something you're developing as part of the recovery effort." "It's something I developed 3 years ago. It's not in your procedures documentation for the same reason the load model isn't." A brief silence. Sandra looked at the whiteboard. "You're saying Holt removed it?" "I'm saying it's not there and it should be. The why is what the audit is going to determine." She was quiet for a moment. Something shifted in her expression. Not defensiveness, which is what he'd expected, but something more unsettled, like someone revising an assumption in real time. "The Beckett-Nolan team's preliminary verbal report," she said slowly. "They flagged the failure pattern as non-standard. I read that as them being cautious about liability. But you're saying they couldn't interpret it because the documentation they needed to interpret it had been removed." "That's what I'm saying." She set her pen down on the table. She looked at Sophia, then back at Ethan. "How much of our technical infrastructure is built on procedures that aren't in our documentation?" He held her gaze. "Enough that this is a significant problem." The room was quiet. Sandra picked her pen back up. She wrote something. Ethan watched her and tried to read what it meant, where she stood, what she knew, whether she'd been aware of any part of what Holt had done, or whether she'd been working in the dark same as everyone else. He couldn't tell. Not yet. He added it to the list of things to figure out. He picked Lily up from school at 3:15. She came out of the building with her backpack half unzipped and her left shoe coming untied and a drawing she'd made in art class that she wanted to show him immediately, before he'd even reached her. "Look," she said, holding it up. It was a drawing of their apartment building, rendered in crayon with somewhat ambitious perspective. There was a figure in a window on the 3rd floor that he recognized as himself, taller than the building proportions suggested was structurally possible, but clearly him. "That's you," she said, pointing at the figure. "Working on something. I didn't know what to draw you working on, so I drew a wrench." The figure in the window was holding something that might charitably be interpreted as a wrench, or possibly a flamingo. "That's a great wrench," he said. "I know." She tucked the drawing under her arm and started walking toward the car. "How was the airplane place?" "Complicated." Good complicated or bad complicated? He thought about the corrupted files, the damage in Bay 7. Sandra Kern's expression when she'd asked how much of their technical infrastructure was undocumented. Danny Okafor's face when he'd brought back the folder of missing files. "Both," he said. She reached up and took his hand as they walked. She was at the age where she sometimes did this and sometimes didn't, with no predictable pattern that he could identify. And the time she did it, he made a point of not reacting because he'd noticed that reacting made her self-conscious. "Mrs. Abramowitz says when things are both good and bad, that means they're real," Lily said. He looked down at her. "She said that?" "During Wheel of Fortune." Lily shrugged. "I think she was talking about something else, but it counts." He decided that it did. Thursday morning, the Crawford & Associates audit team arrived. There were 4 of them, 2 forensic accountants, a corporate records analyst, and a specialist in intellectual property documentation. They arrived in a gray company car with no signage, checked in at the security desk with the professional understatement of people who did this frequently and had long since stopped giving anything away at intake. Sophia met them in the lobby. Ethan was not present for that meeting. He was already in Bay 7, having started the continuity check on the forward integration harness at 6:45. By 9:30, he had preliminary results. The harness was damaged, but not catastrophically. 2 out of 11 circuits showed degraded continuity, which meant repair rather than replacement, which meant the 10 to 12-day timeline was still viable if they moved without interruption. He called Sophia from the floor. "The harness is repairable," he said. "We need to start the disassembly sequence today to stay on track. I need Adler's crew assigned to this full-time, and I need the machine shop in Building A cleared for the bracket fabrication starting this afternoon. There was a half-second pause. He could hear what sounded like voices in the background. She was probably with the audit team. "You'll have it," she said, "and I need authorization for the fabrication specs to be routed through me directly. Not through Kern's office, not through anyone else. Directly." A longer pause this time. "I'll send the authorization in the next hour." "Thank you." He hung up and looked at the damaged assembly in front of him. The harness, the coupling shift, the fractured bracket. It was, in its way, a physical record of everything that had gone wrong, not just in Bay 7, but in the years that had led here. Someone had built something functional and solid, and then someone else had stripped away the documentation that explained how it worked and why, and then someone with an outdated specification had applied the wrong torque value to a load-bearing component, and the thing had broken the way things break when the understanding behind them is hollowed out. He could fix the physical thing. He was already fixing it. The other part, the hollowing out, the years of erasure, that was what the 4 people in the gray car were here for. He picked up his flashlight and got back to work. That evening, after Lily was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table with his external drive and spent 2 hours systematically copying files to a second backup. Time-stamped drafts, email confirmations, original handwritten calculation sheets he'd photographed with his phone years ago, almost on instinct, the way a person saves things they sense might someday matter. He organized them by date, by project, by the corresponding patent filing or company improvement metric they related to. It was painstaking work, and it was also, in a strange way, like assembling a version of the last 11 years that finally had his name on it. Not signed and filed and officially recognized, not yet, but present, intact. A record that said, this work existed, and this is when it existed, and this is the person who did it. He finished at 11:40. He backed the drive up to a cloud folder, then emailed himself a compressed archive with a subject line that just said documentation backup and no message, body. He sat for a moment in the quiet kitchen. Through the wall, he could hear the faint sound of Lily shifting in her sleep. A small movement, the creak of the mattress, then stillness again. He closed the laptop. Tomorrow was going to be a long day. The one after that was going to be longer. And somewhere in the Crawford offices, a records analyst was starting to pull threads that had been buried for years, and none of them knew yet exactly where those threads led or how much was attached to them. The bracket fabrication started Friday morning. Ethan had been on the floor since 6:30, working through the disassembly sequence with Adler's crew. 6 technicians, all experienced, all people he'd worked alongside before. The atmosphere was different from his first day back. The initial awkwardness had mostly burned off, replaced by the specific focused tension of people who understood that the timeline was real and the stakes were real and that there wasn't much room for anything except the work. Danny Okafor had been assigned to his crew at Ethan's request, which had surprised Danny visibly. He was good, quick to understand, honest about what he didn't know, which was more valuable than Ethan could easily explain. Some people spend entire careers learning to fake competence rather than admit a gap. Danny wasn't like that yet, and Ethan wanted to keep it that way. The disassembly sequence took most of Friday. By early afternoon, they'd cleared enough of the damaged components to expose the full extent of the coupling assembly shift, which was, up close, both worse and more manageable than the initial view had suggested. Worse because the misalignment ran deeper into the mounting structure than he'd been able to confirm from outside. More manageable because the mounting structure itself was intact. No deformation, no fatigue cracking, which meant the realignment was a precision problem rather than a materials problem. Precision problems had solutions. You just had to know the tolerances. "Tell me what you're looking at," Adler said, crouching beside him near the base of the assembly. "The shift is about 4 millimeters lateral at the primary mount, which sounds small." Ethan ran his finger along the edge of the mounting flange. "But the integration harness routes through here, and 4 millimeters at this junction translates to about 11 millimeters of deviation at the far end. That's what stressed the circuits." "So we realign before we reconnect?" "We realign, then I do the circuit check again, then we reconnect. In that order." He looked at Adler. "No shortcuts on the sequence, even if we're running late." Adler gave him a look that said he didn't need to be told that. Sorry, Ethan said. Don't apologize. Just keep talking like that so I can remind you of it later. The audit team had established themselves in a conference room on the second floor of the administrative building, and by Friday afternoon, Sophia's assistant had started appearing at Ethan's elbow with increasing regularity, not delivering messages exactly, more like doing quiet reconnaissance on his availability. He understood what it meant. The audit team had found something. He went up at 4:30, still in his work clothes, hands washed, but with grease that had worked itself into the creases of his knuckles that soap wasn't quite reaching. The conference room had been transformed. The Crawford team had covered one wall with printed documents arranged in what appeared to be a chronological sequence: patent filings, internal memos, archive logs, corporate correspondence. There were color-coded annotations. There was a laptop connected to a projector showing a timeline. Sophia was already there, seated at the table with a look that he'd started to learn was her processing face. Not anger, not panic, but a sort of locked-down concentration that she used when absorbing information she found genuinely difficult. The lead auditor was a woman named Carla Ewan. She was 50-something, spare in her movements, and had the manner of someone who had spent decades delivering findings that powerful people didn't want to hear and had made her peace with that being the job. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "Good. I wanted you in this conversation." She gestured to the wall of documents. "We've been working from the materials you provided, cross-referenced against the company's internal records, patent office filings, and archived metadata. I want to walk you through what we found." He sat down. She began from the left side of the wall. The CAR-7 technical brief, his original submission, time-stamped with his name on the cover page. Then the company's modified version, submitted to the patent office 9 months later, with Holt listed as lead inventor and a co-inventor named Philip Garrett, who turned out to be a junior engineer who had worked under Holt and left the company 18 months ago. "The modifications between your submission and the patent filing are largely cosmetic," Carla said. "Different formatting, some terminology changes. The engineering logic is substantively identical." She moved along the wall. "This is not the only instance." She was right that it wasn't. What the Crawford team had found, working backward through 7 years of records, was a pattern. Methodical, patient, and, Ethan thought, looking at the timeline, genuinely sophisticated in how it had been concealed. Holt had not simply taken credit for Ethan's work. He had systematically and incrementally absorbed it into the official company record under his own name, working over years, in a way that was designed to look like normal institutional documentation rather than theft. Technical briefs submitted by Ethan through official channels would be received, acknowledged, and then never formally entered into the archive under his name. Weeks or months later, a derivative document would appear under Holt's, sometimes nearly identical, sometimes incorporating other work, but always tracing back, if you had the original timestamps, to something Ethan had originated. 4 separate patent filings over 7 years. Process improvement certifications. A company-wide efficiency award that Holt had received publicly, with a plaque, at an all-hands meeting 3 years ago. An award that corresponded directly to a productivity improvement that Ethan had engineered. Ethan sat looking at the wall. He'd known. He'd known the broad shape of it, had known about the CAR-7 patent, had suspected the rest. But seeing it assembled chronologically, seeing the full 7 years of it laid out in documented sequence, was something different from knowing it abstractly. It landed in his chest with a specific weight. "There's more," Carla said. "The file corruptions in the archive, they weren't random. The metadata shows they were accessed and modified from a single administrative account 11 months ago. That account belonged to Philip Garrett, who was still nominally active in the system despite having left the company." She paused. "Someone reactivated a ghost account to corrupt the files. The access log was then cleared, but we were able to recover it through the backup server." Sophia had been quiet through all of this. Now she said, "You're saying he planned for this? The corruptions were done in anticipation of scrutiny." "The timing is consistent with that interpretation," Carla said carefully. "I won't characterize intent beyond what the documentation supports, but the timing is notable." Ethan said, 11 months ago was when the 900 series contract was announced publicly." The room was quiet. "He knew the contract would bring attention to the technical documentation," Sophia said slowly. So he cleaned house and inadvertently removed the documentation that would have prevented the installation error, Ethan said, because the updated specification, the one the installation team should have been working from, was one of the documents that got corrupted. Carla looked at him. That's correct. The updated specification for the bracket torque values was among the corrupted files. He let that sit in the room for a moment. So the installation team wasn't negligent, Adler said. He'd come up behind Ethan at some point during Carla's presentation, quiet enough that Ethan hadn't heard him enter. They used the specification they had. The specification they had was the old one, because the new one had been deleted to cover someone's tracks. Nobody disagreed. Ethan looked at the wall. He looked at 7 years of his own work arranged in a sequence that told a story he'd been living without being able to fully see. There's one more thing, Carla said. She moved to the rightmost section of the wall. Mr. Garrett. He left the company 18 months ago. We pulled his departure records. He received a severance payment significantly above the standard formula, roughly 2.5 times the standard amount for his tenure and position. Sophia's eyes moved to the document Carla was pointing at. That would have required authorization at VP level or above. Yes, Carla said. It was authorized by Marcus Holt. The implication sat there, plain and ugly. Sophia leaned back in her chair. She looked tired in a new way. Not the operational exhaustion of someone managing a production crisis, but the specific weariness of someone who had just confirmed that the institution they were responsible for had been used to harm people who deserved better. I want everything you have sent to our legal counsel tonight, she said, and I want to schedule a full briefing with the board for Monday morning. Understood, Carla said. Sophia looked at Ethan. Are you all right? It was a strange question in the context, and he could tell she half regretted asking it as the words came out. It wasn't the kind of question CEOs usually asked in the middle of an audit briefing. But she'd asked it, and he found he didn't mind. I'm fine, he said. I've known most of this for a while. Seeing it documented is... He stopped, looked for the right word. It's different, that's all. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded and turned back to Carla, and they went on. He was late to pickup. Not late by much, 7 minutes. But Lily's after-school program let out at 3:30, and he hadn't made it until 3:37. And she was standing on the sidewalk outside the school with her backpack and her lunchbox and the expression she made when she was trying to look like she hadn't been worried. Hey, he said, getting out of the truck. You're late, she said. 7 minutes, I'm sorry. She got into the truck without making a big deal out of it, which was its own kind of indictment. She buckled her seatbelt and looked out the window. He got in and started the truck, and they drove for a minute in silence. There was a meeting, he said. It went longer than I expected. Was it important? Yeah, it was. She considered this. Okay. He glanced at her. You want to stop at Mario's? Mario's was a corner place 2 blocks from their apartment that made good empanadas, which were Lily's second favorite thing after pancakes. She looked at him sideways. Is that a sorry thing or just a thing? It can be both. She thought about it. Okay. They sat at the little table by the window at Mario's and split an order of empanadas, and she told him about a disagreement she'd had with her friend Marcus at school over whether sharks could live in rivers, which they couldn't. She was right. But Marcus had been very insistent, and she wanted to register her complaint about how unfair it was when you were right and the other person wouldn't admit it. He listened to all of it. Sometimes people take a while to admit things, he said. How long? Depends on the person. She thought about that. That seems inefficient. It really is, he agreed. She ate the last empanada without asking whether he wanted it, which he decided was fine. Saturday was bad. Not the work. The work was going well, actually. The realignment sequence was proceeding correctly. Danny Okafor had turned out to have an unusually good feel for calibration work, and Ethan had spent the morning running the revised continuity check on the forward harness circuits and confirmed that both degraded circuits could be repaired in place rather than requiring replacement. The bad part was Marcus Holt. Holt had been on administrative leave for over a week, which meant he'd been home, presumably, and had presumably been aware that an independent audit team was operating inside his company. And sometime Friday evening, he had called Sandra Kern. Ethan found out about this on Saturday morning when Sandra came to find him in Bay 7, which she didn't usually do. She found him near the coupling assembly with a calibration instrument and a look on his face that she apparently read correctly as meaning he was in the middle of something, so she waited. He finished the measurement and set the instrument down. "Holt called you," he said. It wasn't a question. She looked at him steadily. "Last night. He wanted to know the status of the audit." "What did you tell him?" "That I wasn't in a position to discuss it." She paused. "He wasn't happy about that." Ethan waited. "He said—" She stopped, tried again. He implied that the findings of the audit would be taken out of context, that there were things that looked a certain way in documentation that had legitimate explanations, that you had a history of overstating your contributions. She said it flat, without softening it. He absorbed this. He'd expected something like it. Holt was not a man who accepted a losing position quietly. He was a man who shifted terrain. "What did you say?" Ethan asked. "I said I'd heard him." She met his eyes. "I've been at this company for 9 years, Ethan. I worked alongside Holt for most of that. I thought I knew how this place worked." She paused. "I'm starting to think I had a significant portion of it wrong." He looked at her. She wasn't asking for absolution. He could tell the difference. She was doing something harder, which was sitting with the fact that she'd been operating inside a system she hadn't fully seen. "Did you know?" he asked. "Not specifically. I knew he had a way of absorbing credit, managing perception. I thought that was just how executives operated." She shook her head. "I didn't know about the patent filings. I didn't know about the archive modifications. If I had—" Oh, she stopped. He believed her. He wasn't sure that belief came with any particular comfort, but it was real. "He's going to try to fight this," Ethan said. "I know. He has money and he has lawyers, and he's had 9 months to prepare since he corrupted those files." He looked back at the assembly. "What he doesn't have is the engineering documentation, because that's mine and I have the originals." Sandra was quiet for a moment. "Is there anything you need from me?" He thought about it. "The fabrication specs for the new bracket are being routed through me directly. I need that to stay that way, regardless of any pressure that comes from Holt's direction. It will. And if he contacts you again, document it. Time, date, what was said. Give it to Sophia." She nodded. She started to leave, then stopped. "For what it's worth," she said, "the continuity check protocol you're using, I pulled the original from your backup files. It's genuinely good. Better than anything we had in the formal documentation." He looked at her. He was never entirely sure what to do with acknowledgement, especially when it came late. He accepted it the way he accepted most things, without making too much of it. "Thanks," he said. Sunday was Lily's soccer practice. The field was at a park 20 minutes from their apartment, a flat stretch of grass that got muddy whenever it rained and was currently in a state of post-rain recovery, which meant the kids spent half the practice sliding around and the coaches spent the other half trying to redirect their enthusiasm for the mud into enthusiasm for the drills. Ethan stood along the sideline with the other parents and watched Lily attempt a drill that involved dribbling around orange cones, which she did with concentration that was slightly undermined by the fact that she kept looking at the mud patches rather than the ball. He thought about the audit. He thought about Holt. He thought about the 7 years of documents arranged on the conference room wall. A woman next to him, he didn't know her name, she had a daughter on the team who played defense, said, "You're Lily's dad, right? She's got a good instinct for position." "She does," he said. "I keep waiting for her to figure that out." The woman laughed. "They never figure it out on the timeline you want." He watched Lily make a surprisingly good cut around 2 cones, then immediately step directly into a mud patch and lose her footing and sit down hard. She looked up at the sky for a second, then got up, wiped her hands on her shorts, and kept going. He watched her do that. The practice of just continuing. It was so natural to her that she didn't even register it as a choice. She fell. She got up. She kept going. Not heroically, not dramatically. Just because stopping wasn't an option her mind offered. He didn't know where she'd learned that. He thought maybe she'd always known it. Tamam. Monday morning brought two things simultaneously. The bracket fabrication was complete, and Marcus Holt tried to come back. Ethan was in the machine shop in Building A at 7:15, inspecting the newly fabricated bracket against his specifications. The machinist, an older man named Frank, who had worked at Meridian longer than Ethan had, stood beside him with the specific pride of someone who'd been given a precise task and executed it exactly right. The bracket was correct. Every dimension was correct. Every surface finish was correct. Every tolerance hit where it needed to hit. Perfect, Ethan said. Frank beamed. Don't tell Frank I said perfect, Ethan said to Danny, who was standing behind them both. He'll never let me qualify anything ever again. Danny grinned. Frank pretended not to hear. They were carrying the bracket to Bay 7 when Ethan's phone buzzed. It was Sophia. Holt is in the building, she said. Her voice was controlled, but with an edge under it. He came through the executive entrance with his own key card. Apparently no one had deactivated it. He's in his office. Ethan stopped walking. Danny and Frank continued ahead without noticing. What does he want? He says he wants to review documents related to the audit. He's claiming he has a right to access his own personnel records as part of any proceeding against him. A pause. His attorney called me 20 minutes ago. They're setting up to challenge the audit findings on the grounds that the audit scope exceeded what was authorized in his employment agreement. Ethan started walking again. Let him review whatever he's legally entitled to review, he said. Don't fight the access claim. That just makes it look like there's something to hide. Let the audit findings speak. That's what legal said. But secure the conference room where the Crawford team has their materials. And tell Carla Ewan she needs to know he's in the building. A longer pause. There's something else. Sophia's voice was different now. He asked about you specifically. He asked whether you'd been given formal reinstatement or were operating as a contractor. Ethan thought about this. Why does that matter to him? I think he's looking for a procedural angle. If you're a contractor rather than a reinstated employee, there may be a question about your access to certain documentation. He helped fire me, Ethan said. Now he's worried about my paperwork. Yes. He reached Bay 7. Through the open doors, he could see Danny and Frank setting the bracket down carefully near the assembly, Adler already there with the installation crew. The work waiting. Do whatever you need to do on the legal side, he said. I'm going to install the bracket. There was a brief pause, and then Sophia said something that surprised him. Good. The installation sequence took 4 hours. It was, in its way, some of the most focused work Ethan had done in a long time. Not because it was the most technically complex thing he'd ever attempted, but because so much was riding on its precision, and the precision had to come entirely from inside him, from 11 years of knowledge that wasn't in any file or archive or patent filing. It had to come from his hands and his eye and the specific calibrated judgment that came from having solved thousands of smaller versions of this same problem. He guided Danny through the shoulder junction alignment. He talked through each step as he did it, not for Danny's benefit only, but because articulating the steps out loud had always helped him think. He could feel Adler watching from the periphery, the older man's attention steady and quiet, and it felt like the kind of presence you didn't mind, the kind that added rather than subtracted. The bracket went in at 11:47. Torquey values applied correctly, sequence verified, junction checked twice from 2 different angles. Run the load verification, Ethan said. Danny moved to the test panel. The verification sequence ran for 3.5 minutes. The readings came up on the display one by one. All of them were correct. Adler made a sound somewhere behind him that was not quite a word. One of the other technicians said, "Yeah," quietly. Ethan looked at the bracket for a moment. Good, he said. Now we do the harness circuits. Found. Holt left the building at 2:15. Ethan found out from Sophia in a text message while he was eating a sandwich at the tool bench in Bay 7, which was where he ate most days now. Not because he was avoiding the break room, but because sitting down felt like stopping, and stopping didn't feel right while the timeline was still running. He reviewed his personnel file and left. His attorney called again. They're filing a formal challenge to the audit scope tomorrow morning. Ethan typed back. Does it affect the findings? A pause. Carla says no. The documentation we have is solid regardless of the challenge. It'll slow things down, but it won't change what the records show. He set his phone down and finished his sandwich. Through the bay doors, he could see the afternoon light changing. In 3 days, maybe 4, the harness circuit repairs would be complete, and they'd be able to run the first full integration test. If that passed, the assembly was recoverable. If it passed and the subsequent stress test passed, they were back on contract timeline with days to spare. 7 years. 11 years. A bracket that had taken 4 hours to install correctly. He thought about Holt sitting in his old office, reviewing documents, running a procedural play, looking for a way to shift the terrain the way he always had. He thought about the wall in the conference room and the 12 corrupted files and a severance payment to a man named Garrett that had bought the ghost of an Access account. He thought about Lily sitting down in the mud and getting back up. He picked up the circuit repair tools and went back to work. That evening, he sat at the kitchen table with Lily doing her homework, which was a worksheet on multiplication that she was approaching with the attitude of someone who had been personally wronged by the concept of math. "Why do we need to know this?" she said. "Because math is how you understand how things work." "I understand how things work without math. You understand some things. Math helps you understand the ones you can't see." She looked at him. "Like what?" "Like whether a bracket is going to fail under stress," he said. She stared at him. "Dad? What?" "I'm 7. You can start thinking about brackets at 8. Finish the worksheet." She turned back to it, muttering something under her breath that he decided not to ask her to repeat. He watched her work through the next problem. Slowly, checking herself, erasing once, trying again, getting it right. He made them both tea, chamomile for her, black for him, and they sat together at the table while the evening came down outside the window. The bracket was in. The circuits were being repaired. The audit team had what they needed. Holt's attorney could file whatever he wanted to file. None of it was finished, none of it was clean, but it was moving in the right direction, and Ethan Mercer had spent enough years in manufacturing to know that moving in the right direction was the thing you protected above everything else, even when someone was trying very hard to stop you. The first full integration test was scheduled for Wednesday morning at 8. Ethan had been awake since 4:30, not anxious exactly, or not only anxious, but running through the sequence in his head the way he always did before something significant, the way a musician might run through a piece in silence before sitting down at the instrument. Every step, every connection point, every variable he could control, and every one he couldn't. The harness circuits had checked out on Tuesday afternoon. The coupling alignment was solid. The bracket was correct. He had done the work correctly, and he knew it. Knowing it and watching the test run were two different experiences. He made coffee at 5, packed Lily's lunch at 6:15, and had her at school by 7:40. She'd sensed something in the morning, she always did, and had been quieter than usual over her cereal, watching him the way she did when she was gathering information without asking for it directly. When he walked her to the school entrance, she stopped at the door and turned around. "Is today important?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "It is." She thought about this. "You fixed it right," she said. It wasn't a question. "I think so." "Then it'll be okay." She said it simply, with the uncomplicated confidence of someone who had not yet accumulated enough disappointment to be cautious about it. Then she turned and went inside, and he stood there for a second on the sidewalk before walking back to the truck. He got to the plant at 8:02. The test bay was the quietest it had been since Ethan had come back. The full crew was there. Adler, Danny, the 4 other technicians from the recovery team, plus 2 engineers from the quality assurance department who had been hovering at the edges of the effort for days, contributing little but clearly invested in the outcome. Sophia was there. Sandra was there. Carla Ewan from Crawford and Associates was there, which surprised him slightly. Auditors didn't usually attend integration tests, but he understood it. The test was the hinge point. Everything before it was preparation. Everything after it would be consequence. The 900 series assembly sat in its rebuilt configuration, cleaner than it had looked in weeks. The new bracket installed at the shoulder junction, and the harness rerouted, and the coupling realigned, and every component settled into exactly the position it was supposed to occupy. Standing in front of it at 8:05, Ethan felt something that he didn't have a clean word for. Not pride, that was too simple. Something more like recognition. The object in front of him corresponded to the object in his head, and those two things matched in the way that very few things in his life had ever fully matched. "Ready when you are?" Adler said quietly beside him. Ethan looked at the test panel. Danny was stationed there, which was appropriate. He'd earned it. The kid had worked every day of the recovery without complaint, had asked the right questions, had made himself useful in ways that went beyond what his job description required, and had at some point in the last 2 weeks transformed from a 14-month floor tech into someone Ethan genuinely trusted. "Run the pre-sequence check," Ethan said. Danny moved through it methodically. 14 individual confirmation points, each one called out and verified. It took 11 minutes. Every check came back green. "Pre-sequence complete," Danny said. He looked at Ethan. "Go?" Ethan looked at the assembly one more time. "Go," he said. The test ran for 37 minutes. It was not 37 dramatic minutes. It was 37 minutes of readings on a screen that either matched the expected values or didn't, and for the first 22 of those minutes, the readings matched. Then there was a pause, a single data point that came in at the edge of the acceptable range, and for about 4 seconds, the room was absolutely still. Then the next reading came in. Nominal. The one after that. Nominal. The test continued to its conclusion. Final status, passed. Danny exhaled audibly. One of the QA engineers made a sound into his coffee cup. Adler put his hand on Ethan's shoulder for about 2 seconds, the specific duration of a gesture that meant something without wanting to make too much of itself, and then moved away. Sophia, standing behind the crew, said nothing for a moment. Then, "What's the next step?" "Stress test sequence," Ethan said. "I want 24 hours of continuous monitoring data before I call it complete." "But," he looked at the readings on the panel. "This is what we needed." She nodded. She was keeping herself contained, which he'd come to understand was how she handled relief as much as how she handled pressure. The expression didn't change much, but something around the eyes did. "I'll call the client," she said. The stress test ran through Wednesday and into Thursday morning, and Ethan monitored it in shifts, sleeping 4 hours on Wednesday night and returning to the plant at 2 a.m. to check the overnight readings. The data was clean across all 11 circuits, across every load variable, across the full range of the test parameters. By Thursday morning at 9, he had 25 hours of continuous data, and every point of it said the assembly was sound. He submitted the formal completion report to Sophia at 9:45. She called him 8 minutes later. "The client reviewed the preliminary data last night. They're satisfied with the timeline recovery. The contract is intact." A pause. "Ethan." "Yeah. Thank you." He was in the parking lot, leaning against his truck, squinting into the morning sun. He wasn't sure what to say to that, so he just said, "Okay." She made a sound that might have been a laugh. "I'm going to need you to get better at accepting gratitude. I'll work on it. Can you come up to my office at 11? There's something I want to discuss." He said he would. He spent the time between 9:45 and 11 sitting in the break room with a cup of bad coffee and his phone, sending a text to his sister that said, "Assembly test passed." "Contract is good," she replied with 3 exclamation points and a string of emojis he didn't fully decode. He sent one to Ray Cortez that said the same thing. Ray sent back "told you," which wasn't accurate, but was the kind of thing Ray said. He sent one to Mrs. Abramowitz that said job went well today because she'd asked him last Tuesday how it was going and he'd said he'd let her know. She replied, "Wonderful, dear. I made rugelach. Come by tonight." He pocketed his phone. Around 10:30, Danny Okafor came into the break room, got coffee, and sat down across the table without being asked. They sat for a moment in the specific comfortable silence of two people who had spent enough hours working alongside each other that silence no longer required explanation. "What happens now?" Danny said. "For the assembly? Ongoing monitoring, standard maintenance cycle. I'll write up the full protocol before I—" He stopped. Danny looked at him. "Before you what?" Ethan looked at his coffee. He hadn't fully decided anything yet. The conversation with Sophia was in 30 minutes, and he didn't know what she wanted to discuss, though he had a reasonable guess, and he hadn't decided what he was going to say to it. "Before things change," he said. Danny nodded slowly, understanding that he wasn't going to get more than that and not pushing for it. "Can I ask you something?" Danny said. "Sure." "The load model, the tolerance protocol, the stuff that was in your personal files that wasn't in the archive." He paused. "How long did it take you to develop all of that?" Ethan thought about it. The load model was about 3 months of actual work, maybe another 2 months of revision after I saw how it performed in practice. The tolerance protocol was longer, about 6 months, on and off. Danny was quiet. "You did that at home," he said. "After work. After Lily was in bed, mostly. And nobody—" He stopped himself. "Nobody officially acknowledged it, no." Ethan looked at the table. "For a long time I told myself it didn't matter, that I did the work because the work needed doing and because I was good at it, and that was enough." He paused. "I still believe that. The work needed doing. I was glad I could do it, but—" He stopped. "But," Danny said. "But it matters," Ethan said. "Having your name on the thing you built. It matters." Danny nodded. He looked like he was filing this away somewhere careful, the way young people sometimes do when they understand that something is being handed to them and they want to hold it right. Sophia's office was on the 3rd floor of the administrative building, with a window that looked out over the production campus, the corrugated roofs, the parking lot, the chain-link perimeter, the flat industrial sky of a Midwestern morning. Ethan had never been in it before. It was less decorated than he'd expected, less curated, less performing of executive authority. There was a whiteboard with genuine working notes on it, a desk with actual paper on it, a bookshelf that held a mix of technical references and what looked like management texts in one novel, which was face down at what appeared to be the halfway point. She was on the phone when he came in, gestured toward the chair in front of her desk, and wrapped up the call in about 90 seconds with the specific economy of someone who had gotten good at ending conversations without giving offense. She sat down across from him. "The client call went well," she said. "They're extending the contract timeline by 2 weeks, which gives us buffer, and they've indicated they want to discuss expanding the scope of the relationship in Q3. She folded her hands on the desk. "Which is directly contingent on the recovery effort you led." He nodded. "I also got a call from the board this morning. They reviewed the preliminary audit findings. Marcus Holt's employment has been officially terminated, effective yesterday." She paused. "And the board has authorized a formal recommendation to the relevant patent authorities to review the 4 filings in question, with the company's full support for corrective action." Ethan sat with that for a moment. The patent review process would be slow. He knew enough about how these things worked to have no illusions about speed, but the company's support changed the character of it entirely. Without Meridian fighting him, the documentation record he had would be sufficient. "Philip Garrett," he said. "We've referred his situation to legal. The severance payment, the account reactivation. There are potential civil and criminal dimensions that I'm not in a position to discuss in detail, but the referral has been made." He nodded again. "There's one more thing the board discussed," Sophia said, "and this is actually why I asked you here." She looked at him with the directness he'd come to expect from her, the quality that made her feel less like most executives he'd encountered. "I want to offer you a senior technical leadership role, head of engineering innovation. It would be a newly created position. I want to formalize the kind of work that's been happening informally for years. Oversight of the technical documentation process, direct authority over R&D priorities, involvement in contract technical review." She paused. "Your name on everything your team produces." Ethan looked at her. He'd expected an offer. He hadn't fully expected the specifics. "That last part," he said. "Your name on everything. That's a policy you're proposing for the whole organization? Not just for me?" "Yes, a formal attribution policy. Technicians, engineers, floor-level staff, anyone who originates a process improvement, a design solution, an innovation. Their name goes in the documentation, the record, permanently." She watched him. "It's not complicated. It's just something this company has never done correctly." He was quiet for a moment. If I take this, he said, I need it in writing, not just the offer, the policy. I want the attribution policy codified in the company's operational documents before I accept. She almost smiled. I expected you to say something like that. I also want the policy reviewed by the floor-level staff before it's finalized. Adler, Ray Cortez, the crew leads. If they think it has gaps, those get addressed. Agreed. And I'm still picking up Lily at 3:15. This time she did smile. It was brief, and it reached her eyes, and it changed her face in a way that was less CEO and more person. That's already in the offer letter. He looked out the window at the production campus. He thought about 11 years of walking across that parking lot. He thought about the bracket in Bay 7, sitting correctly in its mounting, carrying exactly the load it was designed to carry. He thought about Danny Okafor asking how long the load model had taken. Give me until Friday, he said. I need to think. She nodded. Friday is fine. He stood. She stood. They shook hands across the desk, and it felt less like a formality than a confirmation of something that had already been established. Two people who had been honest with each other when the situation made honesty difficult, and had come through it with their respective credibility intact. Ethan, she said as he reached the door. He turned. The assembly worked this week. The whole team performed well. But the knowledge that made the recovery possible was yours. I want to make sure you know I understand that. He looked at her for a moment. He thought about the conference room wall, the 7 years of documents, the corrupted files, a man in his office on administrative leave, reviewing his personnel file, looking for a procedural angle. I know you do, he said. That's why I'm thinking about Friday instead of no. He told Adler that afternoon. They were walking the floor of Bay 7 together for no particular purpose, except that both of them sometimes processed things by walking, and the bay was quiet now, the assembly sitting in its stable configuration, the monitoring equipment running its patient continuous checks. She offered you something, Adler said. It wasn't a question. Yeah. You gonna take it? Ethan looked at the assembly. Probably. Adler was quiet for a moment. You'd be good at it. I'd be mediocre at the political part of it. That's what makes people good at the real part of it. They walked to the far end of the bay and back. The afternoon light through the high windows made long rectangles on the concrete floor. The attribution policy is the piece that matters to me, Ethan said. Not the title, not the salary, though I'm not going to pretend the salary doesn't matter, because I have a kid in a truck with a broken tailgate. He paused. The policy matters because it's not about me. It's about Danny, and the guys like Danny who are going to come up through this floor over the next 20 years and deserve to have their names on what they build. Adler looked at him sidelong. You're going to be a pain in the neck as a senior leader. Probably. Good, Adler said. This place could use more of that. But Thursday was quieter. The recovery effort officially wound down. The monitoring data continued, but the active crew work was complete, and the plant returned to something closer to its normal rhythm. Ethan spent the morning writing the full technical documentation for the repair sequence. Every step, every calibration value, every decision point, and the reasoning behind it. Not a summary, a complete record. The kind of document that meant anyone who came after him could understand not just what had been done, but why. He put his name on the cover page without overthinking it. In the afternoon, the Crawford team presented their final findings to Sophia and the board in a closed session. Ethan was not in the room. He hadn't been invited, and he hadn't asked to be. The audit findings were what they were. The documentation was what it was, and his presence in that meeting would have served no practical purpose. He'd spent enough of his life doing the actual work while other people were in the rooms where things were decided. That was the part he wanted to change going forward, but he wasn't going to force his way into a room where he didn't need to be just to prove something. Ray Cortez found him in the break room at 4 and sat down and said, You heard they're doing an all-hands on Friday morning? Yeah. Sophia's presenting the audit findings. Ethan looked up. The actual findings? That's what I'm told. Full transparency. What was found, what the consequences are, what changes are coming. Ray picked up a stir stick and turned it in his fingers. There's a lot of people on this floor who've been wondering for years why certain things worked the way they worked, why credit went where it went. He paused. Friday's going to be a complicated morning. Probably, Ethan said. You ready for that? Ethan thought about standing in that conference room on the day he'd been fired, watching Marcus Holt's hands on the folder, watching Tamara Will's carefully managed expression. He thought about going home and sitting in his apartment with his external hard drive, staring at a folder of documents that said something real about who had built what. I've been ready for it for a long time, he said. I just didn't know if it was ever going to happen. What? The all-hands meeting was in the main production hall at 9 on Friday morning. Nearly 200 people. Every floor of the facility, every department, standing or sitting on the bleachers that folded out from the wall for these occasions. Ethan stood near the back with Ray and Adler, not because he wanted to be invisible, but because he wasn't sure what the morning was going to feel like, and he wanted some room to exist in it on his own terms. Sophia spoke for about 20 minutes without notes. She was direct in the way she was always direct, and she was honest in a way that most people in rooms like that weren't. She didn't soften the findings or route around the hardest parts. She said, Marcus Holt had systematically misappropriated engineering work produced by frontline staff over a period of at least 7 years. She said, the company's technical documentation had been deliberately compromised to conceal this. She said, the failure in Bay 7 was a direct consequence of that concealment, and the company bore institutional responsibility for allowing the conditions that made it possible. She did not say Ethan's name during this part of the presentation. He told her not to. He'd asked her, in a brief exchange the previous afternoon, not to single him out as the central figure, not because he wanted to disappear back into anonymity, but because the point of the morning was not about one person. It was about a pattern that had affected everyone in the building. He didn't want it to become the story of one man who had been wronged and then vindicated. He wanted it to be the story of a company that had operated badly and was choosing to operate differently. She honored that. She spoke instead about the attribution policy, what it would require, how it would be implemented, what it meant going forward. Every process improvement, every innovation, every technical contribution would be documented with the originating employee's name as a permanent part of the company record. The policy would be reviewed quarterly. Employees would have a formal avenue to dispute attribution decisions. She said, this should have always been how we operated. Ethan stood in the back of the room and listened to 200 people receive this. Some of them looked relieved. Some looked angry. Not at Sophia, but with the particular anger of people who had been suspecting something for years and were now having that suspicion confirmed. Some looked like they were trying to figure out how it affected them specifically, running personal calculations. That was fine. That was human. Danny Okafor was standing about 30 feet away, near the front of the floor crew section. At some point he turned around and found Ethan's eyes across the room. He held the look for a second. Ethan gave a small nod. Danny turned back to face the front. After Sophia finished speaking, there was a brief silence of the kind that settles over large groups when something real has been said, and then people started moving and talking, and the hall gradually became loud again in the ordinary way. Adler appeared at Ethan's elbow. Well, he said. Yeah, Ethan said. That seemed sufficient. He called Sophia from the parking lot at 11:15. I'll take the position, he said. A pause. Good, I'm glad. I want to start Monday. Monday works. Another pause. How do you feel? He looked across the parking lot at the building. The corrugated walls, the industrial signage, the specific quality of morning light on a functional building that had never been designed to be beautiful. Like something got corrected that needed correcting, he said. I don't know if I have a better word for it than that. That might be the exact right word for it, she said. He said he'd see her Monday and hung up. Must. He called his sister from the truck. She answered on the second ring with, well? She'd been expecting the call. Took the job, he said. She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. How's it feel? Complicated. Is Lily going to be impressed? He thought about this. She's going to ask if she can come see the airplane building. Can she? Maybe, when things settle down. Ethan. His sister's voice shifted slightly and less teasing, more something else. I'm proud of you for not walking away from it. You could have just rebuilt somewhere else. A lot of people would have. He sat with that for a moment. He thought about the Texas-shaped water stain on his bedroom ceiling. He thought about the morning he'd gotten fired and driven home and sat at the kitchen table not knowing what came next. He thought about picking up his phone in the break room and almost not answering an unknown number. I thought about it, he said honestly, walking away. I know, but you didn't. No, he said. I didn't. Friday afternoon, he picked up Lily at 3:15 exactly. She was already at the curb when he pulled up, which meant she'd been watching for him, though she would deny this if asked. She got in, buckled up, and looked at him with the direct assessment that was one of her more disconcerting qualities. You look different, she said. Different how? She studied him. Less like you're waiting for something. He pulled out of the school lot. He thought about that. I took the job, he said. The boss lady job? It's not exactly, yeah, basically. She nodded seriously. Are you going to be a boss? A different kind of boss than the other kind. She seemed to find this acceptable. She looked out the window for a minute. Does that mean more money? She said. He looked at her. Yeah, more money. Can we get a new truck? The truck is fine. The tailgate doesn't close right. The tailgate is fine. You just have to know how to hit it. She made a face that expressed her opinion of this position clearly without requiring words. He let it stand. They stopped at a grocery store on the way home because he'd promised her pancakes on Saturday morning, and they were out of the good syrup. The real maple kind that cost more than the other kind, and that she had declared years ago to be the only acceptable variety, a position she had never revisited. He let her push the cart through the store, which she took seriously, navigating the aisles with a focus that she did not bring to, for example, multiplication worksheets. They stood in the breakfast aisle while she compared 2 bottles of maple syrup, same brand, different sizes, working out the math on which one was the better value, using the unit price labels on the shelf with a concentration that suggested she might have been paying more attention to math than she let on. This one, she said, holding up the larger bottle. Good call. She put it in the cart with the satisfaction of someone who had made a correct decision and knew it. On the way home, with the grocery bags in the back seat and the afternoon turning orange through the windshield, she said, out of nowhere, Did they say sorry? He knew what she was asking. She'd asked a version of it before on his first day back. The company did, he said, in front of everyone. She was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Was it a real sorry or a just saying it sorry? He thought about Sophia in the production hall, not softening the findings, not routing around the hardest parts. He thought about Adler's hand on his shoulder. He thought about Danny Okafor's eyes across the room. Real, he said. Lily looked out the window. Good, she said simply. They drove the rest of the way home in a comfortable quiet. Saturday morning. Ethan was up at 7, which was sleeping in by his standards. The apartment had the particular stillness of a weekend morning, softer somehow, like the building itself was taking its time. He made coffee, set the good pan on the stove, found the mixing bowl in the cabinet where it lived next to the one Lily used for her occasional, ambitious, usually messy baking projects. He was whisking the batter when he heard her door open. She came out in her dinosaur pajamas with Mr. Pudding under one arm and her hair doing something independent in 3 directions. She climbed onto her chair at the table, looked at the bowl on the counter and said, Blueberries? Already in there. She seemed pleased by this. She arranged Mr. Pudding on the chair beside her. The bunny had his own chair, had always had his own chair, and Ethan had stopped noting this some time ago because it was simply how things were in this apartment, and watched him cook with the attentive proprietary interest of someone for whom pancakes were a serious subject. The pan was good and hot. He poured the first one and watched the edges go from wet to set. Outside the kitchen window, the neighborhood was slow and unhurried. The bodega on the corner was open, he could tell by the propped door. Somebody was walking a dog on the sidewalk below. A cloud was moving through the otherwise clear morning sky with no particular urgency. He thought about Monday. The new office, the new title, The stack of technical documentation work that was already piling up in his mind. The attribution policy needed drafting. The archive gaps needed systematic addressing. The CAR7 patent review process needed his documentation organized and submitted properly. He thought about Danny Okafor and what it would mean to have someone like Danny in an environment where his name would actually be on the things he built. He thought about all the Dannys over the coming years. That was the part of the job he actually wanted. He thought about Marcus Holt. He tried not to think about Marcus Holt too much, not because he'd forgiven him or arrived at some clean emotional resolution about what had been done, but because the man no longer had a claim on Ethan's attention that Ethan hadn't granted. That was different from forgiveness. Forgiveness was a separate project, and he wasn't in a hurry about it. But he decided that the amount of space Holt occupied in his head was something he got to determine, and he'd started determining it downward. Most days he was relatively successful at this. The first pancake came off the pan. He put it on the plate. "How's the first one look?" Lily asked. "Solid." "Can I have it?" "First one's always the test one." "The test one is still a pancake," she pointed out. This was logically correct. He put it on her plate. She poured syrup over it with the deliberate care of someone who understood exactly how much syrup was the right amount and had strong opinions about excess. He poured the second one. This was the thing that didn't get accounted for, he thought, in whatever way people accounted for things. Not the job, not the title, not the audit findings, or the patent review, or the recovered contract. Those mattered. He wasn't going to pretend they didn't, but they existed in a different category from this. A Saturday morning kitchen, a 7-year-old with syrup on her pajama top already, a pan that was exactly the right temperature, a window with ordinary morning light coming through it. He'd spent 11 years doing work that mattered and having no official record of it. He'd been stripped of the documentation, the credit, the acknowledgement. And through all of it, the quiet fury of it, the long controlled patience of it, the morning in the conference room and the drive home and the water stain on the ceiling. Through all of it, this had been here, unchanged, uncompromised, his. You could take a man's name off a patent, you could corrupt the archive, you could rewrite the record in your own favor and build a professional reputation on someone else's engineering. People did this. The world contained people who did this and who were for a long time quite successful at it. But there were things you couldn't touch. You couldn't touch the 7-year-old who looked at you across the kitchen table like you were the most reliable fixed point in her universe. You couldn't touch the knowledge, the actual knowledge, the thing that lived in Ethan's hands and his eye and his ability to look at a broken assembly and see exactly what it needed. You couldn't take that and put your name on it in any way that made it yours because the knowing wasn't a document. It was something else entirely, something that had accumulated over years of showing up, of caring whether the thing was done correctly, of sitting at a kitchen table after midnight working through problems because they were interesting and because the solutions mattered, and because he was, at the core of it, a person who found meaning in making things work. That was what Marcus Holt had never understood. He'd understood that the work had value. He'd understood how to extract the value and redirect it to himself. But he'd never understood where it came from, which meant he'd never understood what he was actually dealing with. You can steal a blueprint. You can't steal the mind that drew it. The third pancake came off the pan. Lily had finished the first one and was waiting with the specific patience she reserved for pancake situations. He put the third on her plate, and she poured more syrup with the same careful hand. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "Is your job going to be okay now?" He flipped the fourth one, watched the edge go from wet to set. "Yeah," he said. "I think it is." She cut into her pancake, ate a piece, considered. "Good," she said, "because I think you're pretty good at the airplane stuff." He looked at her. "Yeah? You explained the bracket thing to me, and I understood it, so you're probably good at explaining it to people who know more than me." That's a vote of confidence. "Mr. Pudding agrees," she said, with the complete seriousness she always brought to Mr. Pudding's endorsements. He looked at the stuffed rabbit propped in its chair, one ear bent at a permanent angle from years of being carried by it, one eye slightly more faded than the other. "Tell him I appreciate the support," he said. "He knows," Lily said. Ethan turned back to the stove. He had enough batter for 4 more pancakes. Outside the window, the cloud was gone and the morning was just morning, plain and ordinary and unremarkable in the way that only the best mornings ever were. He poured the next one and watched it cook. He started Monday the way he'd started every working day for 11 years. Early, before most people were in, with coffee he'd made at home in a travel mug because the break room coffee was genuinely terrible, and he'd decided that at this point in his life he didn't have to pretend otherwise. The difference was the office. It was a small room on the second floor of the administrative building, between the drafting department and a supply closet that smelled like toner. Someone had cleaned it out over the weekend. The previous occupant had apparently been a project coordinator who'd transferred to the Cincinnati facility 6 months ago and had left behind a dying plant, a whiteboard covered in project codes that meant nothing to Ethan, and a motivational poster that he took down within 4 minutes of arriving and put face down in the corner. He'd deal with it later. He set his coffee on the desk. He opened his laptop. He looked at the room. It was not an impressive room. The window looked out at the roof of Building B and a section of the parking lot. The desk had a wobble on the left front leg. The chair was adjustable, but the adjustment lever was stuck at a height that was slightly too low for comfort. These were all fixable problems, or acceptable problems, and Ethan had spent enough of his life sorting fixable from acceptable to not waste time on the distinction. He pulled up the draft attribution policy document that Sophia's team had prepared over the weekend and started reading it with a red pen. He'd been working for about 40 minutes when Danny Okafor appeared in the doorway, looking uncertain in the way people looked when they weren't sure if they were allowed to knock on a door that was already open. "Come in," Ethan said without looking up. Danny came in. He stood near the desk. "They told me downstairs I'm being reassigned to your team." "Yeah." "Full-time?" "For now. I want you on the documentation project and the archive reconstruction. You've got a good systematic mind. You're going to be useful." He looked up. "You okay with that?" Danny blinked. He clearly hadn't expected to be asked. Yeah, absolutely." "Good. Pull a chair. I want to show you what we're working with." Danny looked around. The only other chair in the room was the motivational poster chair in the corner, which he retrieved and set beside the desk with a look that suggested he'd noted the poster but had no intention of commenting on it. Ethan turned the laptop so they could both see the attribution policy draft. "This is good in structure," Ethan said, "and weak in implementation detail. It says employees will receive attribution for innovations, but it doesn't define what counts as an innovation or who makes that determination or what the appeal process looks like when someone disputes a decision." He pointed at a paragraph. "This section here is the one that actually matters, and right now it's 3 sentences long." Danny read it. "So someone could technically comply with this policy and still make the same decisions that Holt made." "Exactly." Danny nodded slowly. He understood the problem. That was what Ethan needed from him. Not just execution, but understanding. "How do we fix it?" "We talk to the people on the floor. We find out what they'd need to feel like the policy had teeth." He paused. "Not just Adler. He's a supervisor. He'll give me the supervisor perspective. I want to talk to the people who've been on the floor for 3-4 years. People like you were 3 weeks ago. People who've solved a problem and watched the credit move sideways." Danny was quiet for a moment. "I can put together a list." "Do that. By Wednesday." The first 2 weeks were not smooth. Ethan had not expected smooth, and he got exactly what he'd expected. There was resistance, not hostile resistance in most cases, but the organic friction of an organization that had operated one way for a long time being asked to operate differently. People who'd been in their roles for years had built their own versions of how things worked, and some of those versions didn't account for the changes that were coming. And there was a period of adjustment that was sometimes uncomfortable for everyone involved. Sandra Kern was the most complicated piece of it. She was still in her role. Sophia had decided that Holt's departure shouldn't translate into a wholesale purge of his department, which Ethan thought was probably right, even though it was also complicated. Sandra had been at Meridian for 9 years. She knew the operations inside out. And in the weeks since the audit, she had been conducting herself with a careful, deliberate correctness that Ethan found difficult to read. She was not obstructive. She attended every meeting she was supposed to attend, participated appropriately, and had not once tried to undermine the attribution policy work. But there was a quality to her engagement, a watchfulness, a reserve that he couldn't entirely decode. They ended up having the real conversation on a Thursday afternoon, by accident more than design. He was walking the floor of Building C and found her there doing the same thing, and they fell into step beside each other with the slightly awkward recognition that they'd both come to the same place for roughly the same reason. "How's the policy draft?" she asked. "Getting better. I've talked to 11 floor staff in the last week. The recurring theme is that people don't trust that the appeal process will be taken seriously. Because it wasn't before." Because it wasn't before," he agreed. They walked. The floor crew was running a normal production cycle around them, the ordinary noise and motion of the plant doing what it was built to do. "Can I say something?" Sandra said. "Sure." She was quiet for another few steps, as if making a final decision about whether she actually wanted to. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Not for what Holt did. I've been clear about what I knew and didn't know, and I believe the audit confirmed that. But for—" She stopped. "For 9 years of accepting an environment where what was happening could happen, where it was possible for someone to do what he did because the culture allowed for it. I benefited from that culture professionally. Even if I didn't know the details, I operated inside a system I should have questioned more." Ethan kept walking. He thought about what to say. He wasn't going to tell her it was fine, because it wasn't entirely fine, and she knew that and deserved better than a comfortable lie. He also wasn't going to perform forgiveness he hadn't fully gotten to yet, because that would be dishonest in a different direction. "I appreciate you saying it," he said. "Directly." She nodded. "What I need from you now," he said, "is the operational knowledge you have. You know this company's systems better than almost anyone. The attribution policy is going to run up against implementation problems that I can anticipate in general, but not in specific. I need someone who can tell me where the specific friction points are before we hit them." She looked at him. "You're asking me to help you build the thing that replaces how things worked under Holt?" "Yeah." "Okay," she said after a moment. "I can do that." They walked back toward the administrative building, and the conversation moved into the operational details. And the thing that needed to be said had been said, and neither of them made more of it than it was. But the patent review process moved at its own pace, which was slow. The relevant authority had received Ethan's documentation package in the 3rd week of his new role. 22 years of time-stamped files, original drafts, email chains, the photographs of handwritten notes he'd taken with his phone over the years. Carla Ewan from Crawford had submitted the audit findings as a supporting document. Meridian's legal team had filed the company's formal support for corrective action, which was, he knew, genuinely unusual. Companies did not typically volunteer to assist in the review of their own patent filings. It had taken Sophia approximately 45 minutes of board persuasion to secure that commitment, which she'd told him about afterward with the flatness of someone who had found the 45 minutes irritating but necessary. The review would take months, possibly longer. The authority's timeline was not his to control. He made his peace with this in stages, which was the only way he knew how to make peace with things. What he could control was the work in front of him, the attribution policy, which was in its 4th draft and getting genuinely better. The archive reconstruction, which Danny was leading with a thoroughness that continued to impress him. By the end of the 2nd week, Danny had identified 47 additional documents that should have been in the official record and weren't, all of them now restored from Ethan's personal backups with proper timestamps and author attributions. The technical documentation standard that Ethan was developing from scratch, a comprehensive protocol for how Meridian would document its engineering work going forward so that what had happened could not happen in the same way again. He was 3 weeks into the job on a Tuesday when Ray Cortez knocked on his door at the end of the day. Ray came in and sat in the chair Danny usually occupied and looked at him for a second. "Something on your mind," Ethan said. "Yeah." Ray rubbed the back of his neck. "They posted the internal job listings this morning. There's a position on your team, documentation coordinator." "I know, I wrote the posting." Philip Garrett applied for it. The name landed in the room with a specific weight. Philip Garrett, the junior engineer who had been Holt's co-listed inventor, who had received the above-standard severance, whose ghost account had been used to corrupt the archive files. He had apparently not been criminally charged. The legal situation had resolved, as these things sometimes did, in a way that involved civil settlement terms that Ethan was not fully informed about, and had decided not to press Sophia on, because there was a version of staying focused and a version of chasing every thread, and he was trying to stay in the first version. But Garrett applying for a job at the company whose archive he had compromised was something he hadn't anticipated. "You're telling me because you want to know what I'm going to do about it," Ethan said. "I'm telling you because you should know before you find out some other way." Ethan looked at his desk. He thought about it. "I'm not going to hire him," he said. "Not for this team. Possibly not for any position that touches technical documentation, which is most of what we're building." He paused. "But that's a professional judgment about fit, not a personal decision. If someone else at this company decides his skills are appropriate for a different role, that's above my authority to determine." Ray looked at him. "You're not angry?" He stopped. "Yes, I'm angry. I've been angry about various parts of this for a long time, but I'm not going to make operational decisions from anger. That's not how I want to run things." Ray nodded slowly. He seemed to be deciding whether this was the right answer or just the dignified-sounding one. "It's the right answer," Ethan said, reading him. "And I also mean it, which is the only way it counts." Ray almost smiled. "Okay," he said, and left. Ethan sat for a moment. He thought about Garrett. He thought about the corrupted files. He thought about the specific calculation a person makes when they decide that covering someone else's tracks is worth a severance multiplier. What that says about what they believe other people are worth. Then he opened the next draft of the documentation standard and went back to work. Sophia called him into her office on a Wednesday morning in his 4th week, which he'd started to recognize as the day she scheduled conversations that weren't about immediate operational problems. "The board reviewed the latest attribution policy draft this morning," she said. "They've approved it." He'd known this was coming. Sandra had texted him the night before with a heads up, which was its own small indication of how things were shifting. Still, hearing it formally was different. "When does it take effect?" "First of next month. We're doing a company-wide announcement Thursday and a training rollout the following week." She looked at him across the desk. "You'll present it to the floor staff. I think it should come from you." He thought about standing in the production hall in front of 200 people. He thought about the all hands where she'd presented the audit findings, and he'd stood in the back. "Yeah," he said. "That's right." She seemed pleased by this. She made a note. "There's something else," she said. Her tone shifted slightly, not more serious, but more personal, in the way he'd learned to recognize. "The Patent Review Authority sent a preliminary communication this morning. I wanted you to hear it directly." He straightened. "The preliminary assessment supports the corrective action request," she said. "They haven't issued a final determination. That will take several more months, but the preliminary assessment finds sufficient evidence to proceed with the review on all 4 filings." He sat very still. That means the process is moving in the right direction," she said carefully. "It's not the final answer, but it's the preliminary answer, and it's the right one." He looked out her window at the building roofs and the parking lot and the industrial morning sky. He thought about 18 months ago, sitting at his kitchen table after Lily was asleep, drafting the CAR-7 brief over 6 weeks, getting up early to work on it before she woke up, checking the formatting, putting his name on the cover page, submitting it through official channels with the specific mixture of pride and hope and naivety of a person who still believed the system would treat the work the way the work deserved to be treated. He thought about the patent filing, Holt's name, the absence of his own. "Several more months," he said. "Yes, I know it's fine," he said. "I've waited longer for less." She looked at him for a moment. "You know, when I took this job, the picture I was given of the technical staff was efficient, essential, but interchangeable. Good at execution, not at initiative." She paused. "I've been CEO for 16 months, and I think I spent the first 14 of them with a fundamentally wrong understanding of where this company's actual value lived." "It lived on the floor," he said simply. "It lived on the floor," she agreed. "I don't intend to make that mistake again." He looked at her. She was 32 years old. She was running a company she'd inherited with problems baked into its foundations. She'd made real decisions when making real decisions was difficult and uncertain and personally risky. And she'd made them because they were the right ones rather than because they were safe. He thought that she was probably going to be good at this. Not perfectly good. She had her own blind spots, her own gaps, and time would reveal them the way time always did. But genuinely good, in the way that mattered. "I'll take the Thursday presentation," he said. "Send me the room setup." The attribution policy presentation was on a Thursday afternoon, not in the main production hall, but in 3 separate sessions, one for each floor shift, because Ethan had asked for smaller groups. Not because he was nervous about speaking to large groups, but because he thought the conversation deserved room to be a conversation rather than an announcement. The first session was the afternoon crew. About 60 people. He stood at the front of the break room extension. Not a stage, just a cleared space, with the policy document printed and distributed and no slides, because slides created a specific kind of distance he didn't want. He talked for about 10 minutes. What the policy required, how attributions would be recorded, how disputes would be handled, specifically, in detail, not in the 3 vague sentences from the first draft. He talked about the appeal process and named the 3 people who would serve on the attribution review panel, none of whom were in management, which he'd insisted on and which had required its own board conversation. Then he stopped talking and said, "Questions." The room was quiet for about 5 seconds. Then a woman in the back, a line tech named Veronica, who had been at Meridian for 12 years and had the specific bearing of someone who had watched a lot of things come and go, raised her hand. "What happens if the supervisor disagrees with the attribution?" "The appeal process doesn't require supervisor approval. You go directly to the review panel." "And the panel has actual authority, not just advisory?" "The panel's decisions are binding. I made sure that was in the language." Another pause. A man near the window. "What about things that already happened? Work that should have been credited and wasn't?" This was the question he'd known was coming. He'd thought about it carefully. "There's a retroactive review process included in the policy," he said. "If you believe work you did in the last 5 years should have been attributed to you and wasn't, you can submit documentation to the panel. They'll review it." He paused. "I won't pretend it fixes everything that happened before. Some of it can't be fixed retroactively in any complete way, but it creates a record, and the record matters." He looked around the room. "This policy exists because things were done wrong here for a long time," he said. "Not by most of you, by people who were in positions to decide how things were recorded and who took advantage of that. The policy is an attempt to make sure that can't happen the same way again. It's not perfect. We'll find problems with it in practice and we'll fix them." He looked at Veronica. "That's also in writing." Veronica held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once with the specific economy of someone who'd been skeptical and had found, provisionally, something that met the bar. The second and third sessions went similarly. Different questions, same undercurrent. Is this real, or is this the kind of thing that gets announced and then quietly doesn't change anything? He answered every version of that question the same way. Not with reassurance, but with specifics, because specifics were the only thing that actually answered it. Danny sat in on all 3 sessions and took notes without being asked to, which Ethan noticed and didn't comment on, because it was the right instinct, and commenting would make it self-conscious. Afterward, walking across the parking lot to his truck, Danny said, "You think it'll actually work?" "I think it'll work better than what was there before. Whether it works as well as it should depends on whether people use it." He unlocked the truck. "That's always the answer. The policy is the structure. The people are what makes the structure live or not." Danny thought about this. "What do you think will determine it?" "Whether the first 3 or 4 attribution disputes get handled correctly. If people see it work in practice, they'll use it. If the first case gets buried, it'll be the last time anyone tries." He got in the truck. "Which is why I'm going to personally review every dispute in the first 6 months." Danny stood by the truck door. "That's a lot of cases." "Probably not that many, and even if it is, yeah, that's the job." He started the truck. Danny stepped back. "See you tomorrow," Ethan said. What? The case that mattered came in the 5th week. a floor tech named Marcus Webb, not the same Marcus as Lily's schoolmate, though Ethan's brain made the association anyway, submitted an attribution claim for a conveyor calibration fix he'd developed 8 months earlier. The fix had been noted in the maintenance log as a floor-level adjustment, the same language that had been used for years to absorb unattributed contributions into the general record. Webb had documentation, a dated notebook entry, a photo of the original calculation on a whiteboard, a text message to a coworker describing the fix before it was implemented. His direct supervisor had declined to attribute it to him on the grounds that the fix was within standard maintenance parameters and therefore not a qualifying innovation. The appeal panel reviewed it in 3 days. They overruled the supervisor and attributed the fix to Webb with a formal entry in the technical record. The supervisor, a man named Patterson, who Ethan didn't know well, came to see him the following day with an expression that was somewhere between defensive and genuinely confused. "The panel overruled me," Patterson said. "Yeah. I wasn't trying to, He stopped. "I wasn't doing what Holt did. I just didn't think it rose to the level of—" "The policy defines what qualifies," Ethan said. "Webb's fix met the definition. That's why the panel ruled the way they ruled." Patterson looked at him. He was in his late 40s, career meridian, had worked his way up from the floor. He wasn't a bad person. Ethan had no evidence of that. He was a person who had operated inside a culture for so long that the culture's assumptions had become invisible to him. "I need to understand this better," Patterson said. "The line between routine maintenance and something that qualifies. That's a reasonable thing to want to understand. Come see me Thursday. I'll walk through the criteria with you." He paused. "And for what it's worth, the fact that you came here instead of just being annoyed about it tells me something good." Patterson looked at him. He wasn't sure whether to be offended or relieved, and settled on something in between. "Thursday," he said, and left. After he was gone, Ethan sat back in his chair and thought about the case. About Webb, who had submitted the claim with the specific, careful documentation of someone who expected to lose and wanted a record of it anyway. About the panel doing its job correctly. About Patterson, who was not a villain, but who had been part of a system that produced villainy by making it comfortable. There was a version of this that was satisfying in a clean way. The corrupt man gone, the policy in place, the first case resolved correctly, the lesson landing, but the clean version was a story, and stories ended. The real version kept going. Patterson would have to relearn habits he'd built over 20 years. The appeal panel would eventually face a case where the documentation was ambiguous. Someone would test the policy in bad faith, and the panel would have to figure out what bad faith looked like without evidence. The archive had 47 restored documents and probably more that hadn't been found yet. None of it was finished. None of it stayed fixed automatically. That was not a pessimistic thought. It was just an accurate one. A Saturday in the 6th week. Ethan was making pancakes. He had gotten, over the course of his life, genuinely good at pancakes. Not in a showy way, not in the way of someone who had a specialty and performed it, but in the ordinary, competent way of a person who had made something so many times that their hands knew it without instruction. Batter consistency, pan temperature, the specific way the edges looked just before the flip. Lily was at the table with Mr. Pudding and a library book, which meant it was a good morning. The library book meant she'd woken up in a reading mood, which was different from a talking mood or a question mood and was generally the most peaceful of the three. He flipped the second pancake. He thought about the patent review, still months away from a final determination. The preliminary assessment was solid, but preliminary was just preliminary, and he'd lived long enough with the uncertainty that he'd learned not to hold it in a way that made the waiting unbearable. He thought about the archive reconstruction. Danny had found 3 more gaps the previous week, smaller ones, all restored. He thought about Patterson, who had come to Thursday's meeting and asked questions that were more thoughtful than Ethan had expected, and had left with a clear understanding of the line and a somewhat chastened expression that Ethan thought was probably the beginning of actual change rather than just performance. He thought about Marcus Holt. He hadn't heard Holt's name in 2 weeks, which felt significant. Not because the situation was resolved, the legal and patent matters were still in process, but because Holt had stopped occupying the foreground. He'd become a background fact, something that had happened and that continued to have consequences, but that was no longer the central thing. The central thing was the work. The work that Ethan was doing now, with his name on it, in a room with a wobbly desk leg and a window that looked at a parking lot, was the central thing. That was where it had always been. Holt had tried to move it. He hadn't managed to. Lily looked up from her book. "You're thinking," she said. "Yeah." "About work?" "Some of it." She considered this. "Is it good thinking or stuck thinking?" He flipped the third pancake. "Good thinking." She went back to her book. He watched her read for a second. The specific concentration she had, eyebrows slightly together, lips moving almost imperceptibly on words she found interesting. She looked like her mother when she read. He'd noticed this for years without it getting easier or harder. It was just true. Claire had been 31 when she died. Aneurysm, no warning, on an ordinary Thursday in October. She'd been making a grocery list. Lily had been 18 months old and would have no memory of her mother that wasn't mediated through photographs and the things Ethan had told her. He'd told her a lot. He'd been deliberate about it. What Claire had been like, what she'd cared about, what she'd found funny, what she'd been bad at. He told Lily the unflattering things too, because he wanted her to have a real person for a mother rather than a saint. And he thought Claire would have agreed with that. He missed her in a way that was no longer sharp. That was the thing about grief at distance. It rounded out. Not smaller exactly, differently shaped. He'd gotten accustomed to the weight of it the way you got accustomed to a particular chair. It was just there, a constant, something you stopped noticing except when you shifted and it became specific again. He thought she would have had opinions about the last several weeks. Claire had had opinions about everything, vocally, and she'd been right often enough to be annoying about it. She would have had thoughts about Sophia, probably positive ones. She'd respected directness in other women. She would have been angry about Holt in a way Ethan hadn't fully allowed himself to be, white-hot and vocal and then over it. She would have been proud of the attribution policy, not in a soft way but in a specific, practical way. This is the right thing. Good. Now don't mess it up. He set the pancakes on the table. Lily put her book down and pulled her plate toward her with the practiced deficiency of a person who had done this many Saturday mornings. "Can we go to the park later?" she said. "Yeah, after lunch. Can I bring Maya?" "If Maya's mom says yes, sure." She picked up the syrup with the careful reverence of the truly devoted. "Dad." "Yeah." "Are you happy?" He looked at her. It was the kind of question that was simple and wasn't. He thought about what happy meant, specifically, as opposed to what it sounded like in the abstract. He thought about the job and the policy and the archive and the patent review and the wobbly desk leg. He thought about Danny Okafor asking the right questions. He thought about Adler's hand on his shoulder for 2 seconds. He thought about 200 people in a production hall hearing the truth out loud for the first time. He thought about a 7-year-old who told him he'd fixed it right and expected to be believed. "Yeah," he said, "I am." She seemed satisfied with this. She poured her syrup. "Mr. Pudding's happy too," she said. "In case you were wondering." "I was." She ate her pancakes. He ate his. Outside the window, the neighborhood was doing its Saturday thing. Unhurried, ordinary, the bodega open, the dog walker from a few weeks ago making his regular circuit with a dog that had no apparent sense of direction. The truth was that happy wasn't even quite the word. Happy was what you felt at a party, or when something went right. What Ethan felt on this particular Saturday morning was something quieter and more load-bearing than that. It was the feeling of a person who had been through something real and had not come out the other side unchanged. He was not unchanged. He was not the same careful, controlled man who had sat across from Marcus Holt in that conference room 11 years ago and learned early to keep his head down, but had come out the other side intact. Still himself. Maybe more himself than before, in the way that pressure sometimes revealed what was actually there rather than destroying it. He'd built things. He'd had them taken and had gotten them back, imperfectly, in process, not finished. He'd raised a kid who asked good questions and carried a stuffed rabbit and understood multiplication better than she admitted. He'd found, in the wreckage of something he'd tried to walk away from, a reason to walk back in. That wasn't a happy ending. It was a true one. And true ones were harder to find, slower to arrive, and worth considerably more. Lily finished her pancakes and pushed her plate back. "That was good," she said, with the tone of a critic delivering a fair review. Same as always, he said. Same as always is good, she said, as if this were obvious, and picked her book back up. He cleared the plates. He washed the pan. The water ran hot over his hands, and he watched it run and thought about nothing in particular for about 30 seconds, which was a luxury he was getting better at allowing himself. Then he dried his hands and went to sit at the table with his coffee while Lily read, and the morning continued the way good mornings do. Without fanfare, without resolution, just forward, one moment into the next, the way that ordinary life carries everything worth keeping.